The marriage that eventually produced Charles II of Spain looked, on the day it happened, like good politics. Every marriage in the chain did. That is the part people skip. The most inbred royal in European history was assembled out of individually reasonable decisions, each one signed off by careful men who thought they were protecting the family. So here is the question this video is actually about. What if they had stopped? What if, somewhere near the start, the Habsburgs had written a rule that said, no more cousins, no more nieces, go find a stranger to marry, not because they understood genetics. Nobody in the 16th century understood genetics, just because a pope leaned on them, or a bishop got nervous about all the dispensations. What does Europe look like then? The honest answer is stranger than the fun answer. The fun answer is a healthier Spain that keeps everything it had. The honest one is that you get a completely different family ruling a completely different set of lands, because some of the crowns the Habsburgs wore only fit because of exactly the marriages you just banned. Let me put you in a room first. Madrid, the tail end of 1700. There is a king in that palace, 38 years old, who has spent his whole life being the most important sick man in the world. Charles II. He can barely chew. He had married twice and no child came from either marriage, and by this point nobody expected one to. Half the chancelleries of Europe had been quietly running the numbers on his death for years because when he went, he took the question of who rules Spain and its empire down with him, and there was no clean answer written anywhere. Ambassadors were basically loitering outside a deathbed. That is where the real timeline is pointing. Now let us back up almost 2 centuries and see if we can bend it somewhere else. Start with what the Habsburgs were actually good at, because it was not fighting. Other houses won territory with armies. The Habsburgs won it at weddings, and they were shameless enough to say so out loud. There was a line they liked: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." It is smug, and it is also basically accurate. Maximilian I married Mary of Burgundy, and suddenly the family had Burgundy and the Low Countries, some of the richest ground in Europe. His son Philip married Joanna of Castile. Joanna was not supposed to inherit much of anything until a run of deaths cleared out everyone standing between her and the Castilian crown. That is the piece the motto conveniently leaves out. The weddings only paid off because people kept dying at the right moments. Luck did as much work as romance, then it all lands in one person. Charles V, grandson of that Burgundian match, inherits Spain, the Burgundian territories, the Austrian claims, and an overseas empire that was still being mapped as he held it. One man sitting on more of the world than anyone since the Romans, and most of it delivered by inheritance rather than conquest. He could not actually govern all of it, so late in life he split the load. Spain and the West went to one branch, Austria and the imperial centre to another. Here is where the family did the thing that eventually broke it. To keep those two branches from drifting apart, they married them to each other, over and over. Charles V sent his own daughter Maria to marry her Austrian cousin Maximilian II, and the official family history is refreshingly blunt that this was the first of many such matches, arranged on purpose to keep the dynasty stitched together. In the short term, the logic was airtight. A cousin from the other branch carries the inheritance claims back into the house. A relative seems a safer bet than some foreign duke who might switch sides the moment it suits him. After the Reformation cut Europe in half, the pool of acceptable Catholic royal brides got narrower anyway, so the family kept reaching for the people it already had. Again. And again. Now watch what that does over a few generations, because this is the genuinely interesting part. Charles V married Isabella of Portugal, first cousins. That produced Philip II. Philip II then married 4 times, and the list tells you almost the whole story on its own. His first wife, Maria of Portugal, was his double first cousin, which is exactly as concentrated as it sounds. 2 separate cousin relationships folded into one marriage. Later he married his own niece, Anna of Austria, and that union produced the next king, Philip III, uncle and niece. Not a scandal at the time. Dispensed, blessed, put on in a cathedral. It keeps going. Philip IV also married a niece, Mariana of Austria, and that is the marriage that finally produced Charles II. So the last real Spanish Habsburg king came out of an uncle marrying his niece, sitting on top of generations of cousins marrying cousins underneath. The tree by that point is less a tree than a piece of knotwork. I do want to be fair to them, because the lazy version of this story is that they were all marrying their siblings, and they were not. Philip II also married Elizabeth of Valois, a second cousin to seal a peace with France, and Mary I of England, and neither of those was a close kin match by the standards that did the damage. Plenty of individual Habsburg marriages reached outside the family. The problem was never one incestuous wedding. The problem was the repetition, the same tight loops and their uncle-niece unions coming back generation after generation until they stacked. There is a number that captures how far the stacking went, and it comes from a 2009 study that rebuilt the family pedigree. Out of the 11 marriages in the main Spanish royal line, 9 were between third cousins or closer, nearly 82%. Most families do not have one marriage like that. This branch could barely produce one that was not. The researchers behind that study reconstructed something enormous, a pedigree of more than 3,000 people running back as far as 16 generations, and then they did the arithmetic on how concentrated the ancestry had become. They express it as an inbreeding coefficient, and I want to be careful about what that number means, because it gets mangled constantly. The coefficient estimates the probability that the 2 copies of a given gene in a person are identical because they came down from the same ancestor on both sides of the family. For Philip I, near the start, it sits around 0.025, barely anything. By the time you reach Charles II, it has climbed to 0.254. That second figure is the one that makes people gasp, and it deserves a real explanation rather than a gasp. An inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 is roughly what you would expect in the child of a brother and sister or a parent and child. Here is the trap though, and the researchers themselves flag it. Charles II was not the product of siblings. His parents were an uncle and his niece. The reason his number reached the sibling range anyway is that all those earlier loops kept compounding. Every cousin marriage upstream added another shared ancestor, another way for the same stretch of ancestry to turn up twice in one person. You end up at the genetic concentration of a sibling union without anyone in the immediate picture doing anything that extreme. It accumulated. It crept up on them across 200 years. The consequences show up in the nursery coldly. Among 34 children born into these Spanish royal families between 1527 and 1661, 10 did not live to their first birthday. 17 did not reach the age of 10, half the children gone before adolescence in the best-fed, best-doctored households in the country. The study found that the fall in survival tracked with the inbreeding in a way that was statistically real, not noise. A follow-up a few years later widened the lens to 71 Habsburg marriages across both branches and found the same grim relationship between inbreeding and dead infants. This was not a Spanish quirk. It was the family pattern, and Spain just pushed it hardest. Now a caution the good researchers put on their own work, which is easy to sail straight past. They floated the idea that recessive disorders could explain a lot of Charles II's condition, and then they explicitly labelled that as speculation, not a diagnosis. Nobody has Charles II's genome. What we have is a coefficient and a row of tiny coffins. That is enough to say accumulated inbreeding was very likely feeding the catastrophe. It is not enough to hand the man a specific medical chart across 4 centuries, and anyone who does is guessing with far more confidence than the evidence allows. You have probably seen the jaw, the famous Habsburg lower lip and the jutting chin, passed down through portrait after portrait until it reads like a family signature. There is a 2019 study on exactly this, where specialists scored 66 portraits of 15 Habsburgs and found that the projecting lower jaw did get more pronounced as the pedigree got more inbred. So the jaw and the inbreeding do travel together. Real result. I would keep a short leash on it though. 15 people is a small group, and portraits are portraits, painted by court artists who had their own habits and their own reasons to flatter or exaggerate a royal face. The study supports a link between the inbreeding and the jaw. It does not show the jaw did anything. The chin did not cause the infertility and it did not end the dynasty. It is a visible symptom riding along with the invisible problem, which is a very different claim from the one you usually hear shouted. One more bit of honesty before we start tearing up the timeline. A single cousin marriage is not a death sentence. Modern genetic counsellors put the baseline chance of a child arriving with some congenital or genetic condition at around 2 to 3%, and for first cousins it rises to something like 5 or 6%. Higher, yes. Doom. No, the Habsburg disaster was never one cousin at the altar. It was the same close unions, uncle and niece included, repeated across generation after generation, until the odds stopped being a small tax and became the main event. So, the counterfactual. The whole trick with a what-if is to pick a change a real person could plausibly have made, and then follow the consequences honestly instead of steering toward the ending you already want. Here is the change. Call it 1525. After another round of church squeamishness about all the dispensations the family keeps requesting, Charles V accepts a house rule. No Habsburg marries anyone closer than a distant cousin. That knocks out first cousins, cousins once removed, and the uncle-niece matches in a single stroke. And the very first casualty of the rule is the marriage Charles was about to make himself to Isabella of Portugal, his first cousin, in 1526. That is not a small edit, that is the whole board. Because if Charles does not marry Isabella, then Philip II is never born. Not born sick, not born healthy, never born at all. A different wife means a different child, full stop, and every Spanish Habsburg king who came after Philip is erased along with him, because they all descend from him. This is the part that separates an honest counterfactual from a comforting one. You do not get the same familiar kings with better bloodwork. You get strangers. The whole cast is recast from 1526 forward. And the cost lands immediately, long before we get anywhere near a healthier bloodline. Isabella did not arrive cheap or arrive alone. Her marriage carried an enormous Portuguese dowry and a direct family bridge to the Portuguese ruling house. And decades down the line, it was that same Portuguese blood, passed to her son, that handed Philip II a hereditary claim to the throne of Portugal itself. Break the marriage, and you break that claim before it exists. Charles's new heir, whoever he turns out to be, rules Spain and the American Empire perfectly well. He simply is not the grandson of a Portuguese king through his mother. Hold on to that. It comes back and it changes a continent. Skip ahead a generation. With the rule in force, the Spanish king can no longer keep reaching into the Austrian branch for a bride, and the Austrian branch can no longer keep sending its daughters south. Both halves of the family have to go shopping in the wider market. Italian dynasties, the Wittelsbachs in Bavaria, Polish and Lithuanian royalty, the occasional carefully chosen French house. This cuts two ways, and a serious version of the story has to admit both. The gene pool broadens, the compounding loops stop forming, the nursery very probably stops burying half its children. Big upside. The catch is that every one of those outside marriages drags a foreign in-law with foreign interest into the family, and more to the point, the two Habsburg branches stop being a single sprawling household, constantly trading brides. They become allies instead of one household, and allies drift and haggle and keep their own counsel. The thing that made the Habsburgs genuinely frightening was not only the land, it was that the Spanish and Austrian halves shared blood so thickly that they tended to move as one block. Loosen the marriages and you loosen the block. A Habsburg super-empire straddling the continent gets less likely, not more, precisely because you have stripped out the reciprocal claims that let one branch swallow the other's inheritance. Now the claim I told you to hold on to, 1580. In real history, the direct Portuguese royal line ran out of heirs, and Philip II stepped forward with a genuine hereditary claim through his mother Isabella, the Portuguese one. He backed it with an army, beat out his rivals, and merged the two crowns. For 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, one monarch wore both Spain and Portugal at once. That meant a single man briefly commanded almost the entire Iberian Peninsula and both of the great Atlantic colonial empires together. It is an almost obscene concentration of global power, and it rested in large part on a wedding arranged back in 1526. Take that wedding away, and the alternate Spanish king in 1580 walks up to the Portuguese succession empty-handed. No Portuguese mother, no strong hereditary claim. The Portuguese pick one of their own instead, a Braganza, or Antonio of Crato, or some compromise candidate the great houses can stomach. Could Spain still just invade? Of course. Great powers have never needed clean genealogy to start a war. The legal case is gone though, and the aristocratic backing that a real claim buys you is gone with it. So the union that felt inevitable now reads as a long shot. Most likely Portugal simply stays its own country, with its own court and its own empire never swallowed, and therefore never nursing the grievance that in real history boiled over into the revolt of 1640. That one divergence ripples out through the whole global contest. With Portugal independent, its colonies stop being a convenient way to punch Spain in the side. The Dutch and the Portuguese still tear at each other over the spice routes and the Atlantic. That rivalry ran on its own engine, so do not picture Portuguese losses simply evaporating. The shift is narrower and sharper than that. Hitting Lisbon's empire is no longer the same act as hitting Madrid's. The strategic map quietly redraws itself, which carries us to the big one, the empty Cradle. The real 18th century opens on a war fought over Charles II's corpse, more or less. He died in 1700 with no child, and two great claimants, the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs, each insisted the entire Spanish Empire was rightfully theirs. That argument became the War of the Spanish Succession, more than a decade of fighting spread across Europe and its oceans. Run the alternate line instead. The whole reason the succession detonated was that the Spanish royal house had reproduced itself into a corner, one frail, childless man at the end of the branch with no obvious spare. A broader, healthier dynasty does not guarantee a son in every generation, nothing does, but it makes it far likelier that somewhere in the family there sits a brother, a nephew, a cousin, a plausible heir with a clear place in the queue. Give the alternate Spain that, and the trigger is simply not there. The bomb has no detonator. Europe might still fight around 1700. Louis XIV rarely needed much of an excuse, and there were unsettled quarrels lying around everywhere. It is not this war, though, not a continental brawl over an empty Spanish throne, and the difference cascades. No forced installation of a French Bourbon in Madrid, so no Bourbon Spain. No carving up of Spain's European possessions among Austria and Savoy and the rest. And at the table that ended the real war, the 1713 peace, Britain walked off with Gibraltar, with Minorca, and with the Asiento, the coveted contract to sell enslaved people into Spanish America. Erase the war, and Britain does not collect those particular winnings at that particular table. I want to be careful here, because it is tempting to overreach, and it is where these arguments usually fall apart. Britain does not stop rising. Its strength came from its banks, its public credit, its navy, its trade, and its willingness to keep fighting ruinously expensive wars, none of which hang on this one treaty. Gibraltar is a specific prize lost, not the whole arc reversed. A Britain without those two footholds has a weaker grip on the Mediterranean and probably goes hunting for another base, or picks another fight to grab one. The rise continues, only the route it takes is different. Austria shifts too. Without the Utrecht windfall, it never gets its sprawling second life in the old Spanish Netherlands and in Italy. It leans back toward what it actually cared about: the Ottoman frontier, Hungary, Bohemia, the endless politics of the Holy Roman Empire. And here is a discipline the sloppier version of this story ignores. You cannot just delete the later War of the Austrian Succession either, because in this altered family the specific people who fought it, Charles VI and his daughter Maria Theresa, very likely never exist. Change the marriages and you change every heir downstream in both branches, not only the Spanish one. France, for its part, loses the enormous prize of seating its king's grandson on the Spanish throne, and the whole system of Bourbon family alliances that shape the rest of the century never assembles, because there is no Bourbon Spain to build it around. Savoy, which in real history parlayed the war into a royal crown, and a first step toward a leading Italy someday, plays a different hand entirely, since the winnings it built on are no longer on the table. There is one more downstream effect worth naming out in the colonies. No Bourbon Spain means no Bourbon reforms in their historical shape, the 18th century overhaul of taxes and militias and church policy across Spanish America. A Habsburg-descended Madrid would still govern that empire, but it would reform it on a different clock and in a different temper, which changes the texture of colonial life and colonial resentment in ways that are impossible to pin down but real. Here is the discipline that separates a serious what-if from a fantasy, and it is worth stating plainly. Most of the deep machinery of European history does not run on one family tree, and pretending it does is how these things go stupid. The Reformation still happens. Habsburg rulers, healthy or not, still square off against Lutheran princes and Calvinist cities, and a Europe splitting along confessional lines. The long grinding struggle with the Ottomans in Hungary and the Mediterranean still shapes the whole centre of the continent. The Dutch revolt still has its real causes, taxes and religion, and constitutional grievance, so it does not politely dissolve because a marriage changed. American silver still pours into Spanish coffers, still warps European prices, still leaves Spain hooked on credit and military spending it cannot really afford. France still spends the era trying to break out of Habsburg encirclement, and over the long haul, the slow tilt of wealth and power toward the naval, commercial, credit-driven states of the Northwest still favours the countries that would become the great powers, healthier Habsburgs or not. The thing everyone secretly wants out of this, the Habsburgs surviving into modern times, stays firmly in the low-confidence bin. Healthier heirs can stretch a dynasty out. They cannot freeze a continent in place. What eventually came for Europe's monarchies was war and revolution and nationalism and industrial economies and mass politics, and none of that cared in the slightest about anyone's inbreeding coefficient. Fix the bloodline, and you have deleted one spectacular succession disaster. You have not repealed the modern world. So what did the cousins actually buy them, and what did banning them actually cost? This is where the whole premise flips, and it is the reason the honest answer beats the fun one. We started out treating the cousin marriages as the family's disease, and biologically that is exactly what they were. Those same marriages were also the family's circulatory system, though. They kept the inheritance claims locked inside the house. They bound Madrid and Vienna into something tighter than any ordinary alliance. They recycled crowns and lands back into the dynasty instead of letting them bleed away to strangers. The Habsburgs were the most interconnected ruling house in Europe, precisely because they kept marrying each other, and that interconnection was a huge slice of their power. Ban the cousins and you rescue the bloodline, and you dissolve part of the glue in the very same motion. You get a Spain that probably keeps a Habsburg-descended king past 1700, rather than collapsing into a foreign war. You get a Portugal that probably stays free. You get no War of the Spanish Succession as we know it, no Bourbon Madrid, no Gibraltar changing hands in 1713. What you never get is a bigger, stronger, invincible Habsburg Empire. If anything, you get a smaller one. The marriages that were poisoning the family were, at the exact same time, doing the work of holding its map together. Strip all the speculation away and one thing survives it cleanly. Charles II, the frail last king of Habsburg Spain, would never have been born, because the wedding 2 centuries upstream that started the compounding was never allowed to happen. No Charles II means no empty cradle in Madrid in 1700, and no empty cradle means the 18th century opens on a different war, a different Spain, a different balance of power across the whole continent. The family got to choose, in effect, between a healthier bloodline and a tighter grip on Europe. In real history, they chose the grip, kept marrying in, and rode it all the way down to a 38-year-old king who could not close his own mouth and could not leave an heir behind him.